and welcome to the 139th episode of Authors Love Bookstores, broadcasting here on A Mighty Blaze. I'm your host, Kimberly Hensle Lowrance. If you're new to A Mighty Blaze, welcome. We're happy you're here. We're a group of volunteer creatives who host online literary events to support books, authors, and the wider publishing community. Here on Authors Love Bookstores, my co-host, Joe Moldover, and I bring you conversations between authors and their favorite indie booksellers to shine a light on storytelling, creativity, and the small businesses that enrich our community. I have been so looking forward to today's episode, so let's just jump right in. We are going to have one more guest. We've had some internet inconsistencies. So once our second guest comes, I'll just pop her right in. But let me introduce Julia Fine, who is here with us today. Julia is the author of 3 novels, The Upstairs House, which won the Chicago Review of Books Award for Fiction, What Should Be Wild, which was shortlisted for the Bram Stoker Award for Superior First Novel, which my book club read last year and had an excellent conversation. It almost came to blows over the ending and what everyone thought.
No.
Like whatever, yeah, it was one of those conversations.
Wow, so like the perfect book club book kind of.
Perfect book club book. And Julia's brand new book is out now. It's called Maddalena and the Dark. So good, I loved it. And I'm very excited to talk about it today. Julia lives in Chicago with her family, and where she teaches writing and she writes these wonderful books. Fun fact, this is Julia's second time on Authors Love Bookstores. She joined us back in 2021 on a panel I hosted about parenting and creativity. It was a wonderful group of authors we had on. We've been able to have, I think, everybody back on a second time, including Melissa Rivera is going to be on this fall. We've had Kate Hope Day, Katie Gutierrez. So we're going to put a link below in the broadcast to that show so you can watch it after today's episode. Our other guest who will be joining us is Kate Harding. Kate is an MFA and a PhD, and she is the event manager at Bookends and Beginnings, which is an indie bookstore in Evanston, Illinois. It was founded by Nina Barrett in 2014. Kate is also a writer. She's been the author, co-author, or co-editor of 4 books, and her essays and opinion pieces can be found in a variety of outlets, from the Washington Post to Cosmopolitan to Newsweek to Salon, and many others. I actually have a list here of all of them. So she's a prolific writer, and she's also a creative writing instructor, and she lives in Chicago. Okay, welcome Julia and Kate, who will be with us.
Thank you for having both of us. I'm sure Kate would agree.
Yes, not Kate's fault. Her internet clicked out right before we went live, but she is endeavoring to get back on. So to our audience, if you have questions for our guests, we'd love to hear them. Just put them below in a comment. So, Julia, let's talk about this beautiful book of yours. I love this book. I felt like this book was a magnet drawing me to it.
Thank you. I mean, that's like what every writer wants to hear, right?
Yeah. It was on my must-read books of the year, and I'm not the only one. Vanity Fair calls it beguiling. Oh, such a good word. Chicago Reader calls Maddalena and the Dark a stunning, sensual novel that drips with period details, gothic atmosphere, and teenage intrigue. Book Riot calls it a lushly dark musical novel. Publishers Weekly gives it a starred review and says that you deliver a masterful exploration of the shifting power dynamics of the protagonist's relationship. Moody and sumptuous, Kirkus. I could go on and on and on. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations. So tell our audience about your book. For those people who haven't yet read it, how would you describe it?
So Maddalena and the Dark is set in Venice in the early 18th century, and it is about 2 teenage girls who are music students of Antonio Vivaldi, who in real life taught music and wrote music for this sort of all-girls orphanage church sort of hospice place. Venice was unique in that they had, this is like a long explanation, but Venice was unique in that they had a lot of social services, I guess. And so this had begun as an orphanage for just foundling children, but over the course of, it was associated with the church. And so over the course of several hundred years, all of these different orphanages basically were sort of had competing church orchestras, but it was the only all-female instrumental and vocal orchestra in probably the world, definitely in Europe. And so this is a story about two girls, one who grows up as an orphan at this school and another who is sent to the school sort of to escape and repair her family's name that's been damaged in this scandal. And it's about their relationship with each other and what happens when they sort of strike up a bargain with this mysterious creature in the Venetian lagoon.
It is really something like I haven't read before. It's so original. And I wondered, where did this start for you? This, like, where was the spark? Was it Venice? Was it music? Was it these two girls and their relationship? How did you find your way into this story?
Yeah, so it was really the school. So the Ospedale della Pietà, which was one of like 4 competing like ospedale, which again, there's no real equivalent because they were basically like different back in like the Middle Ages, like different sort of sects of like monks or nuns, you know, started their own charitable organizations, and they sort of turned into these, like the translation into English is hospital, but like it's not a hospital. It's more like an orphanage conservatory. And so I knew again that Vivaldi had taught violin. He was like the violin master and then the concert master, and that a lot of his music he had written for these young women who were playing music. And I knew that that existed, and I knew like, oh, and it was happening in Venice, and it just felt like such a wonderful setting for a novel, both because like Venice is really a magical place, and also because when you think about any sort of like all of these young teenage artists on top of each other competing for solos and first chair, and it just, you know, the combination of like hormones and artistic ambition, it felt too good to be true. So once I figured that out, and I was like, all right, I'm just going to read everything I can about 18th century Venice, and the more that I read about just like the way that their social systems were set up, the more the book like fell into place in terms of like, oh, you know, the nobility, only the youngest sons would marry in these noble families. And so it's like, oh, well, there's a plot point, because like if you've got 10 kids and only one is allowed to get married, like what are you going to do with the other kids? You know, like where are all of these poor daughters going to go? And so things like that, and also like sort of some of the rituals of Venice, which, you know, is known for the like months long carnival where everyone wore masks, or at least the aristocracy mostly wore masks. And they had other sort of rituals that fit very nicely into this idea of there being something more to the lagoon and the water than what meets the eye.
Oh, so ripe for a story.
Really, it was.
Really like handed to you on a platter, like all these different elements that you could draw upon and create this bewitching novel. I mean, I know the word is beguiling, and I just felt like, oh, that's such a perfect description of the book. Do you remember the first scene that you wrote?
Yeah, the first scene that I wrote ended up being the prologue to the book, which I felt, it's funny because I feel like whenever you have a prologue, or at least in my experience having a prologue, like people have varying opinions on whether or not prologues make sense, or they want to keep them, or, you know, do you need it? But to me, it felt very important to sort of open the book. It's a scene between these like 2 girls sort of whispering together after dark. And I wanted that to be the core of the relationship, and it, like that to be the thing that you sort of remembered, because as things go off the rails, like I think it's important to go back to like, but they once were like this, you know? So that was the first scene I wrote. And then I sort of went, so the book is told, there are two protagonists, Maddalena and then Luisa, and the point of view, it sort of jumps back and forth from one point of view to the other. And I basically would write sort of a little in one point of view and then switch, and then a little in the other point of view and then switch, in a way that I think for past work, it had been much more, you know, I'd work on one point of view, and that would be sort of a long period of time working and then jumping, as opposed to just sort of going back and forth. But it felt and the whole writing of the book felt, you know, I was trying to sort of lean into this idea of like trading a melody back and forth between instruments in like a piece of music, and, you know, having like a theme with different variations. And so I think that it sort of naturally fell into that as well.
And you wrote a great piece about that in LitHub, and we're going to put the link below so if people want to spend some more time reading that and kind of understanding your approach to writing the novel. Did you find it easier or harder or more natural to do that switch of back and forth as opposed to spending all the time in one POV versus the other?
Yeah, I think that I was able to see, because part of what I really wanted to say with this book or talk about is how you can have two people who are experiencing the same thing, but interpreting it just like so vastly differently, and how that can lead to miscommunications and a variety of things. And so I felt like I sort of needed to know in real time, like what one was thinking, because they'd make a decision based on how they interpreted, like, say you have like one sort of fulcrum event and one thinks of it this way and the other thinks of it that way. And then like what they choose to do only makes sense if you know what they're thinking. So I felt like I really had to be in both their heads at once. And I did write, I ended up doubling up a lot of scenes, like writing them from both points of view and then trying to find the strongest one. And I also have, I think the book asks you to be patient because there are sort of scenes that repeat through the other character's eyes. But to me, it felt like a necessary part of what I was trying to say with the book. So even if it was a little slower.
I like that because it also gave me as a reader the sense of uncertainty. Whose point, like which interpretation is the one that's the truth, and it sort of speaks to the idea that we all have our own truth, right? All sort of see a situation differently through the lens of our own existence. And I like that. It just added to that feeling of, I don't know, just like what's going to happen next, and that sort of tension. I know that you did a research trip to Venice.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. And tell us about that. How because had you written the book before you went? Or was
I, in my mind, what I would have ideally done is gone as sort of a pre-writing research, I think. And I did a ton of I did like a year of research before I even started writing. And I think like ideally, going to Venice would have been part of that research trip. But because I wrote this book sort of height of the pandemic, like I started working on it, I think in January 2020. And so it got like, just plans got derailed.
Yes,
and so by the time I was able to go, it was I actually had tickets to go. And then there was like the Omicron wave, and I pushed it back again. But so by the time that I was able to go, I had written and revised the majority of the book. Like I had restructured things and sort of done the major edits with my editor, which ended up being actually really wonderful because it felt almost like a pilgrimage where I could hit up all the different spots that I mentioned, and I could imagine sort of what it would feel like to be walking down these places. And I could check, it was sort of more like a fact-checking trip in the end, which was really cool because I felt like I had this connection to the city in a way that I definitely would not have had if I had gone and then written. Like it felt, and Venice is such a great city for that too, because it looks very similar to how it looked, in 1717, just because like, a lot of the facades are unchanged. So it was really a magical experience, blessing in disguise, kind of, I don't know, who knows, but it happened the way it happened.
I did an interview for A Mighty Blaze with Maggie O'Farrell last year, talking about her book, The Marriage Portrait, which also takes place in Italy. And she mentions that that's the key to writing a book, is choosing the location that you want to visit.
Oh, I think I'm like, okay, why would I ever not write about my travel destination?
I think it's why there are so many books set in Paris. Because
probably. I mean, and Venice too, it gets a bad rap, I think, because a lot of people like do Venice, think of it as like, I'm going on my grand tour and I'll spend like, 2 days in Venice, and they go to all of the really touristy, crowded, pigeon infested spots. But if you just like go slightly off the beaten path, like it's such a great, interesting city. And at least when I went, which again was like during COVID in early March, so like not really when anyone wanted to be traveling, it really wasn't very crowded. So that part was nice too.
Did you change anything? You said that the book was done and it was a pilgrimage, but was there any element or influence from that trip that you came back and said, oh, I have to make this change because of what I saw, what I felt?
I think that because so much of the book, again, like the social structures influence like the plot itself. And since that, like you don't really need to be in the city to know that, like none of that changed, but a lot of like the visceral stuff, like, you know, what it smells like, what it feels like. There were some things that I got spot on just from having been to like other European canal cities, you know, but there were other things where I was like, oh no, this isn't what it's like, or details like, that I knew I needed to add in. Like I remember going under bridges and like seeing all the barnacles, and I was like, oh, this is definitely a detail to add. And then there also was the logistics of, so the book takes place, there's like a key scene that takes place on Lido, which is sort of that like, it's where the Venice Film Festival takes place. It's sort of like a long beach that buffers like the Adriatic Sea and the canal, and there's a key scene there, and I had like thought about how they were going to get there, and I was like, I'm going to go and walk and make sure, because it obviously like things would have been different in the 1700s, but I was like, if I want them to go through, like, are they going on a canal? Are they going around into the ocean? Like, it was very important to me that be like logistically possible. So that was one that I spent a while on, which I think was probably silly, but
No. I mean, I
don't know. Like, if you ever need to get from Venice to that particular spot on the ocean, I can tell you exactly how long it would take. So.
But I think that's so important, because have you ever read books where maybe it takes place in your city and they've gotten it wrong? Like,
oh my gosh, yes.
I will not name the book I read recently that takes place in Boston, where right where I live, and it was wrong. Like the characters walking down the street, and it's like the author wrote, then they turned right. I'm like, no, they don't turn right there, and
you know
it's ruined.
Where I'm in Chicago, and so like The Bear, which I love, I think it's a wonderful show, but they always refer to streets as like West. There's one line where they're like on West Lawrence Avenue, and they're like, no one has ever called it West. Like all streets are East-West, but no one ever says it. Like,
so see, that stuff matters.
Yeah,
those details really matter.
Yeah.
Another big part of this book is music. Louisa and is especially a musician. Madalena becomes a musician. I was fascinated by this part of the book. I wondered about your musical background. Do you play the violin?
I don't. I do not play violin. I played piano growing up, although I would hesitate to say that I can read music and sort of like, you know, sound something out. I took voice lessons growing up, so that I had experience with. And I was exposed to a lot of classical music growing up, and my younger brothers played cello fairly seriously all through like basically like kindergarten through high school. Wow. So I had like exposure, but not enough to write the book without doing, again, like a ton of research. And I watched a lot of videos of musicians playing, and I watched a lot of, you can go and find these like master classes where a really fabulous, famous musician is like teaching a Juilliard student, you know, and they just film it and you can hear. And so a lot of like the language they used and the things they were doing, it was like, because it's one thing too to like know what a violinist does, and another to be like, how would an elite violinist try to get even better? So that was really useful. And then of course I had some friends who read through it and were like, oh no, this is how you hold it. You better change this thing. So I hope I did it justice. And I also read, I did as much reading as I could, sort of like memoir and sort of musicians on music and things like that. But yeah, it was definitely like the two main research components were sort of the historical aspect, like Venice in particular, and then the music.
You made a playlist.
I did.
For this book. Was that a playlist? And we'll put the link below. Was that something you listened to while you?
Yeah, I basically had like Baroque violin on repeat while writing, which felt appropriate. And then I also had gotten to, so this would have been like June 2021. I don't remember when it was, but whenever it was, I had gotten to a place where I was trying to figure out some of the motivations. And then Olivia Rodrigo came out with the album Sour, and I listened to it and I thought, oh, this is what I was looking for. So a lot of her stuff too just had a big influence on the particular like relationship dynamics, and like I think that that's an album. I really love that album. And I think that part of why I love it is she lets herself look really ugly on it, like emotionally. Like she lets herself both be vulnerable, but also she isn't casting herself in the, like, it's not, like, I don't know. I think sometimes like a breakup album, it's like, oh, well, here I am. I'm the victim. I'm going to cast myself in the best possible light. And on that one, I feel like she owns it, but she's like, but I still feel this way. So sorry. And I really loved that because I felt like that was something that, one, I wish that I had realized I could do sort of as a younger woman in relationships or even just in self-expression. And it just felt like such a perfect fit with the project that I was working on, which ended up being Maddalena and the Dark.
Isn't that fascinating that there can be music that's written at this time period that can influence a story set in the 1700s? That there can be this connection with the past in these modern days through art. I'm not very elegantly explaining that question, but I find that really fascinating that we can find these links and sources of inspiration. It helps bring maybe the past into the more modern era, that you can find this way to tell the story, or you can find harmony, I guess, in telling a story in the past from something that's being created now.
Yeah, I think so. And I also, am I frozen?
No, you're not.
Good, not good?
You're
okay.
Good.
I also, the thing that I really was deliberately trying to do is I feel like there's a lot of like period stuff lately. Like I'm thinking of like the show Dickinson or The Great, both of which I love those shows. But what they're sort of doing is they're taking like a modern sensibility and sort of like a, third wave feminist and plopping that personality onto a historical figure, which is fine. And I think works especially well on both of those shows. But I didn't want it to feel like, oh my gosh, these are girls who have been time traveled into the past, but have sort of the same ideas and values and thoughts on things as like contemporary teenage girls. Like I wanted them to be a product of their time. And so I was looking for the things that like the through lines where, even if you were raised in an orphanage in like 1700s Venice, you still would have this feeling. Just because I don't know, I think that it doesn't, I think it's important to look at some of the like uglier stuff about history. And I don't think that this particular book, like I don't think Maddalena and the Dark is a book that really like dives in and tries to recast, but I do think that we're not doing anyone any favors by like writing these modern historical figures. And so that was something I was really conscious of. I was like, well, some of these things, like they seem really bad from a modern perspective. But like if you were in 1717, it was just par for the course. So.
Well, you're a teenager. You're a teenager in 2023. You're a teenager in 1717, but perhaps the stakes are different.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like definitely different in the 1700s when you're 15 and you're trying to find a husband.
Oh my gosh, yeah, and like context is different. Yeah, something I think about too is like there's a relationship in the book where there's a massive age gap, which like, oh yeah, it'd be super gross if it was set in 2023, but like in 1717, I don't know, like was anybody really consenting? Like no. So.
Well, the girls definitely of that time were tools.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think about this comment you made earlier about just the social structure of Venice and how only one child got married in the family, only the youngest son got married, and how their lives were so prescribed on the male side, and the female side, you were just going to get married, and you had to marry the right person to further your family, and
or you went to a convent, which was the only other alternative, because God forbid you be just a single woman.
But there's this great thing where Maddalena is considering the convent, and she's like, well, my cousin went there and she had, puppets. Didn't seem so bad.
Well, oh my gosh, these convents in Venice in particular too, because they had this, it was like a massive problem of like, what are all of these noble girls going to do, because they can't get married to somebody under their like social station, and there's only one wife, there's only one son per family getting married. And so like, what are all the daughters going to do? And so it was like boarding school. Like it was like, like hotel nunnery type. Like
Yeah.
they couldn't go out and they couldn't live their own lives, but they had like their families would pay and they'd have like really nice food and they could have visitors and but it was not at all, it wasn't when you think of like, oh, I have to go to a nunnery and it's like in the middle of nowhere. And so it's like, no, it's in the city and you still have like performances and things. Like it still is terrible because your life is so you just are sent wherever you're sent. But if you have to go to a nunnery, like you could do worse than being rich and noble in Venice in the 1700s.
I think we could talk forever about these, the social structure of Venetian society, because it does sound fascinating. And sort of limiting this idea that only one child gets married. I don't know how that.
So it's the money. It's because I think is what happened. Like Venice is so interesting too, because they never had a king, but they did have like sort of these powerful noble families. And in order to just like consolidate and not dilute all the money, like you could only pass it down to one. Like you can't be supporting all of these other random grandchildren. You need just the one. So,
I was talking to a friend recently about Maddalena and the Dark, and I described it as the Hans Christian Andersen version of The Little Mermaid meets Yellow Jackets meets Don't Look Now, the Julie Christie and Donald Sutherland. Have you ever seen this movie?
No, I haven't.
It's Julie Christie and Donald Sutherland. It's like a horror movie from the 70s that takes place in Venice. Not that you've written a horror movie, but that the atmospheric, the sort of like sort of supernatural, eerie Venice kind of a thing. But especially for me, as I was reading your novel, I kept thinking of The Little Mermaid. And we were talking a little bit about this before we started the show. And then you wrote a Substack about it, and we're going to include that link below. And also just a shout out to Julia's Substack. If you're not already subscribed, check it out below. I just was struck how that fairy tale and the real version, not the Disney version, is one of, well, it's brutal and painful and it's about sacrifice and ambition and desire and the consequences. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that fairy tale. Was it an influence on this book? Just talk about a little bit about that.
Yeah. I think I knew very early on that I wanted there to be some sort of magical Faustian bargain with the water, which again, like Little Mermaid is a Faustian bargain story. It's like, what will you trade away? She's, will you trade away your soul for whatever it is you want? And so I knew I wanted that. And in researching, I learned that at the Ospedale della Pietà, there were, normally you would go in and you would play, either if you're a really elite musician, you get to be in the chorus, like the orchestra. If you're not that good, you get to be the help, or like you might do laundry or you might cook or do, other sort of something to keep the Ospedale going. Or you have the option of getting married. You could take vows somewhere else, or you could get married. But if you got married and you had gotten any of that musical training, you were not allowed to ever play publicly ever again. It was like a legally binding thing where you could not play for anyone. And so thinking about like these girls who, at age 5 start playing music and literally their whole life is, practicing music and going to church, to be like, oh, you're 16, you have an offer of marriage. Like, what are you going to do? Are you going to give up sort of your art, like your voice, and never be able to play again? Or are you going to go off in this sort of other world? And so it felt just like, oh, this is The Little Mermaid. And so that aspect of it felt like such a gift almost that this had been a rule for these women. Although it, and a lot of the book too is this idea of like, can you ever make a good decision when you're like 15, 16 years old? Like, I don't think you can. You're just so young, so there was that aspect of it. And then I also was interested in the original Hans Christian Andersen story at the very end. So in The Little Mermaid, the Disney version, the mermaid gives up her voice, sees the prince, Ursula tries to interfere, I don't even remember how, but like it all ends up, there's like a battle and it's all happily ever after. And then, it's all, she marries the prince basically. But in the original, fairy tale, the prince falls in love with somebody else. And she has been given, like if he falls in love with someone else, you'll turn into sea foam or whatever it is. And so then the sea witch is like, well, hey, you don't have to turn into sea foam. If you just, here's a knife, if you just murder him, then you can just like go back to being a mermaid. And the Little Mermaid, I think she like spends 20 seconds where she like goes in and peeks at him and it's like, I couldn't. And then, basically that, I don't know, it's unclear. She has to like do 300 years of good behavior to maybe have the option to go to heaven. I don't know. It's all very convoluted. But anyway, I was interested in that moment of deciding like, oh no, I could never. It's like, really, you gave up your entire life. You gave up your voice and your tail and your family and everything for this guy who now is like, okay, I'm just going to marry someone else. And you like, don't even consider choosing yourself. So that was interesting to me. And I felt like there was something to play with there because when I think of myself as a teenagers I know, like just human beings that I know, like it should be more of a choice. Which again, like, a fairy tale versus a more fully drawn character. There's lots of reasons why in the original it doesn't make a ton of sense. But to me, that was like sort of felt like a hinge point and something that I wanted to sort of poke at.
Well, especially since teenagers are completely self-consumed.
Yes, they're so selfish.
With their own needs.
and so confident. I was thinking about this book. I think like the reason that this book makes sense and these characters make sense is because like to me, when you're a teenager, you're both like so self-confident, but you have like no self-esteem.
Yep.
And I think that combination of things, it's just like striking a match, like fuel the fire, like of course bad things will happen.
Yes, and you're also a short-term thinker.
Yes.
You cannot think about the consequence. It's very difficult. Your brain hasn't developed to be thinking about the long-term consequences, which is what's the false note in the original Little Mermaid. It's because she's a teenager and at that point she shouldn't be able to think about anybody else. She should just be able to think about herself. But she does make
and like he was awful to her.
Really does.
Yeah.
And she loved him. But she denied who she was to become
she gave up everything. She walked on knives. She did, all this stuff for him. And then, no, and I do not buy that she'd just be like, okay.
I guess she was a good person, I guess. Maybe she was actually not a teenager. We don't know. Maybe mermaids age differently than the rest of us. Maybe. But it's relevant to this story because there are parallels in what you've created here. And you have a character, I'm not going to say who loves to play music. And it's an obsessive, maybe obsessive. I don't know if that's the right word. It's part of who she is.
Yeah.
It's part of who she is. And that's maybe a realization that she has as the book goes on, is how important music is to her.
I think so.
Yeah. So I thought that part of the book that examined like the parallels with the Little Mermaid. I thought that was great. And we've included the link to the Hans Christian Andersen story so people can go read it. I will say, I told Julia before we went live that I read that as a child, the original version, and it like deeply, deeply imprinted on me. I thought
it's really disturbing.
Yeah. That was a very, very disturbing fairy tale. Very, very. You are a writer of, I said this word before, bewitching books, I think is bewitching, about girls and women who are hungry. They're seeking their voices, their independence, their place in the world, their power. And it makes me so curious about the books that shaped you. So when you think about the books you read as a kid or as a teenager, as an adolescent, which are the ones that imprinted on you, that shaped you as a writer, that influence what you write today?
Yeah. I mean, I remember the first book that I remember really feeling like obsessed with, I think, was The Golden Compass. And those books, like as I was growing up, like they were written as I was getting older. And I think I was the right age too, because those, that series gets progressively sort of more adult and difficult and philosophical. And so it was just perfect. So I love those. As a kid, I read a lot of like Diana Wynne Jones. Really liked her. And then as I got older, I think like Angela Carter has been a huge influence for this book, Jeanette Winterson, her book, The Passion, which I feel like I'm almost like trying to write 100 years, maybe it's like 80 years earlier, sort of the same sort of book. But yeah, I love that. What else? Helen Oyeyemi has been a big influence. Yes. I think Shirley Jackson,
of course,
sort of who you would expect in reading my work. And then try to think of more sort of when I was younger, Tana French I really love, although I don't know that I feel like I can't do what she does, but I can read it and really love it.
So it looks like Kate won't be joining us. I think her internet hasn't been restored. So we should take a moment to talk about Bookends in the beginning. So when we invited you to be on the show, that was the story you wanted to talk to. So tell us a little bit about the bookstore, your connection to it.
Yeah, so I do not live in Evanston, although I love Evanston and think it's beautiful. And, in my dreams have like a massive mansion on the lake, which is not most of Evanston. There's just like one part of it where it's just, it's like the dream of what living in Chicago might be. But Bookends and Beginnings, I think that I first went not long after they opened. And one of the things I loved about them is actually no longer sort of part of them, because their original location was like almost like a coach house. And you had to go through this alley behind the street to get there. And it really felt to me like you were going like through the forest into a magical world. And it was really special, although I think it was, what is special to some is like sort of scary at night to others. So I think from like a sales perspective, their new location, which is not through an alley, is bringing them more business. But that was sort of my initial introduction to Bookends and Beginnings. And it's just a really lovely store and worth checking out, and not that far from like Evanston is just sort of just north of Chicago. So it's definitely easily accessible for anyone who lives in the city.
So we've been including links below to pick up Julia's books from the store. So please, and links to the store. So please check it out. One of the things we love so much about indie bookstores are the author events. We love those conversations. And I wonder if you've been just coming off your book tour where you've been going around and going to bookstores and traveling. Was there a particular event that you did that was a highlight?
So I went to Santa Fe to Collected Works bookstore.
Yes, you've had the show.
Yeah, and there is a bookseller who actually, as of like 3 days ago, no longer works there, but she had been a big fan of What Should Be Wild, my first book, and had like hand sold it like no other, and just, we had met through social media, and when this book came out, was like, oh, do you want to come here and we'll do an event? And my publisher agreed because they're very generous and wonderful. And so I went, and it was really great to like meet her. I was in conversation with her. And again, like, I think she's like single-handedly responsible for like half of the sales of my first book. She just is, I don't know, like they're booksellers, like if a bookseller is behind something and wants to hand sell it, like that is why things are successful. So I'm so grateful to her. But anyway, at the bookstore, they had two young women musicians. They had a violinist and a pianist playing Baroque music, and it was just magical. It was really great. And like Santa Fe is a very cool place. I had never been. I was only there for like a very brief few hours, but it was really wonderful.
Terrific. So we'll include links again below. Yes, Margaret, booksellers are magic. We agree. So please pick up a link, go follow the links, and pick up Julia's books. So our audience always loves to hear what the authors on the show are reading. So we, of course, read Maddalena and the Dark. You're done with this book. Read all of Julia's other books. But what are you reading? What's on your bedside table? What are you looking forward to reading?
So right now I am reading a book called Vantage Point that's coming out next summer. It's by Sarah Sliger, who wrote Take Me Apart, which came out 2 or 3 years ago. So it's sort of a thriller.
Yeah.
It's based on, it's like a family who's sort of Kennedy adjacent, and the son who's running for a Congress seat in Maine. And I don't know, I'm not even sure actually how they're going to start describing it. There's so many spoilers, but Sarah is just like a wonderful writer. And I'm lucky enough to be reading this sort of almost done draft. And it just is like calling to me every second of every day. And then another one I'll recommend is coming out, I think in September, definitely this fall, is People Collide by Isle McElroy, who they also wrote The Atmospherians, which I also highly, highly recommend. But People Collide is about a husband and wife who are sort of remotely, she's teaching English in Bulgaria and he has sort of followed along. And one day they wake up and they have switched bodies. So it's almost like Freaky Friday, but husband and wife. It's so good. And Isle McElroy just is such a fabulous writer on the line level and so witty, and it's like clever and incisive and really, really good. So that's coming out. I can't remember who. I think it's like Harper Via, I think. And then I also am really obsessed with this series of historical romance novels by Evie Dunmore. I don't know if you've read them. The first one is Bringing Down the Duke. And then, and there's a series. The fourth one is coming out soon, but the first three are just so much fun. They're set, and it's the first female class of students at Oxford. So I think it's like the late 1800s. I can't remember exactly when it is. And it just goes through like the students and their romance. It's like a big hug. I love like a really well-written, smart romance novel, and I think like these really fit the bill. There's so many good things, but those are my like exciting forthcoming ones, I think.
Excellent. We put the links below so people can check those out. Now we got some questions from the audience. Oh, Julia, are you working on your next book? Can you tell us about it?
You know, I have an idea that I'm sort of working on, but I'm not sure if it's the next book or it's like the one after, just based on how I've been feeling with it. So right now I'm in a period of like trying to just be receptive to the universe.
That's sometimes you have to do that, right? You have to like.
I think so.
And do you find that if you force it, it's not the right one?
Yeah, I think it's more a matter of like having an idea of what I want it to be and like not being able to like break the glass quite yet. Like I just haven't found the way in to such an extent that I feel like maybe it's time to just like put it away for a year or two and then come back to it. So we'll see what happens.
I would imagine it's also hard to start a new project while you're promoting a project.
It is. Yeah, it definitely. It's a lot of time. And also in the summer with children who require a lot of care.
Don't they?
When they're not in school. Yeah.
Yes. We know that. We had one more question. Let me see. Oh, how does teaching writing influence your own writing?
Oh my gosh, it is so wonderful. And I feel very, very lucky because not only do I get to read really good student work and sort of feel like, oh my gosh, I feel like a scout, or it's like I spotted you and like all I want to do is like give you everything I can. But it also is, I think sometimes it forces me to slow down with my own stuff. Like I'll hear myself giving advice to a student that I am not necessarily taking, but should be taking. So that is definitely helpful. But for Maddalena and the Dark, I was teaching a class on like the foundations of the novel, which was a class for basically people who like had thought about writing a novel, but weren't really sure how to start, but had an idea and like, what would they do? And it was like summer 2021. So it would have been like right after the vaccine, but when we realized the vaccine didn't work quite. So anyway, it was like I had like one in-person class in that time period, and I had been doing all of this research about Venice, but I hadn't really like put the book together yet. And so I had activities that I was giving my students, and I complete the activities along with my students, and it ended up a book. And I feel very like, oh, okay, I can teach myself to write this one particular book at least. But it is really, I feel very fortunate to get to look at people's work and help people and teach writing.
It's a good reminder to people who are in writing classes when you get those exercises that they're not make work, that they are legitimately designed.
They're supposed to help. They're supposed to help.
And they do.
And if they're not helping, tell your instructor and they can find you something else. There's like, don't waste your time on, things that don't work for you.
Well, I'm sorry that Kate couldn't join us, but we encourage everyone to check out those links below and go check out Bookends and Beginnings. We know that many of you tell us that when you go on vacation, you check out the bookstores we have on the show. So definitely if you're in the Chicago area, please make a pilgrimage to Bookends and Beginnings. I have one last question for you. And so I read your book when I got it a couple of months ago, and I've been rereading it. And so I noticed this. I love rereading books. I don't always get to do it, but when I always find that if you read it a second or a third time, you find something.
I think that's like the ideal as a writer. That's like what I envision is ideally someone will. I know it. People don't have time, but like that is the hope.
Yes. So I noticed this, and I wanted to know if it was purposeful. So when the book begins, I'm not going to have any spoilers. So the book begins. It starts off with, "There is so much that Louisa doesn't know." That's such a good first line, because you're like, what doesn't she know? But that it ends with, okay, I can't read the whole bit because
it is on purpose. I know what you're saying. I know what
you're saying.
Yeah.
So I'll read the last line, which is, "There might have been a better way, but if there was, she'd never know." And I loved, and again, I didn't notice that until the second read, but this idea that there's a parallel in the opening line and the closing line. And I wanted you to, and you're saying that was intentional. Yay. I'm glad I caught that. This idea that the characters don't know something and still don't know something. Yeah. But we're not going to tell you what it is, of course, because we don't want to blow it. Last thing I want to do is spoiler a book for someone, but that was intentional. Tell us about that. Tell us about the process.
So it's funny because initially there was another line after that, and my editor suggested we cut it for other reasons, but then as soon as she suggested we cut it, I was like, oh, here, this, this is what we're trying to say here. So it worked out well. So I guess it was like subconscious, but it is something that I noticed and like deliberately, because it was sometimes when an editor thinks something should go, there's always like the option of like, if you want to rewrite it or if you want to add something else. And I was like, no, this is the perfect place to end because it sort of completes the circle.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been so much fun.
Oh, good. I'm very glad. Again, to our audience, Maddalena and the Dark, Maddalena and the Dark, please check it out. I know that I have talked it up with friends, may have had another copy sitting in my office to give as a birthday present next week to someone else. And I hope you'll check it out, especially pick up a copy from Bookends and Beginnings. To our audience, if you liked today's show, and we certainly hope that you did, please subscribe to A Mighty Blaze on Facebook to get notified of our other events. We are on Threads now as well. We're on Twitter, but hop over, or you can hop over to our website, amightyblaze.com, to sign up for our newsletter. It goes out once a week and gives you the rundown of all of the interviews. We'll be back next week on July 26th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time with Laura Littman and Greedy Reads in Baltimore. And if you're a regular viewer of the show, we've been on this campaign to host a bookstore in every U.S. state. Next week, we're finally getting to Maryland. I don't know how it is after 3.5 years that we have not been to Maryland before, but finally getting there. And then after that, we'll have one state left. If you know what it is, let us know. We know what it is, but we'd love to hear if you do as well. Please check out Julia's novels. Congratulations on the book, Julia. Good luck.
Thank you so much
with it. And we hope everyone that you'll tune in again. And until we see you again, be well and keep reading.